Clara's scream echoed off the steel walls of the wine cellar, sharp and panicked, as the door of the industrial freezer slammed shut with a cold finality. "Michael! Michael, please!" she cried, pounding her fists against the metal with what little strength she had left. Her belly heaved beneath the thin satin of her evening dress, the baby inside her kicking with urgency as if sensing the danger. On the other side of the glass, Michael didn't flinch. He simply turned to the private chef who had wandered in after hearing the noise. The chef froze mid-step, his eyes locking on the horrifying scene just before Clara's image disappeared. "Behind the steel!" "She's pregnant," the chef whispered, trembling, voice barely audible over the quiet hum of the cellar's cooling system. Michael adjusted the cuff of his jacket, expression calm as stone. "She's unstable," he said coolly. "Tried to hurt herself. I had no choice." The chef stared at him, uncertain. "You want to keep your job?" Michael asked, stepping closer. "Then you didn't see anything. Say a word, and your work visa is gone by morning." The chef swallowed hard. He looked back at the freezer door, then nodded once, the conflict obvious in his eyes. Without another word, he backed away and disappeared up the stairs toward the clink of glasses and string music above. Michael took a moment to straighten his tie, then headed up to the main hall, where 100 guests waited, unaware that the pregnant wife of the host was locked downstairs in a freezing tomb. Inside the freezer, Clara's knees hit the floor. The cold sliced through the thin fabric of her gown like knives. She gasped, her breath forming a white cloud that hovered briefly before vanishing into the sterile air. Her trembling hands reached for the door again, but it was sealed tight. She pounded against it, nails scraping metal until they broke. Blood mixed with frost as she slid down against the wall, sobbing. Her body curled instinctively, protectively around her belly. The chill seeped into her bones, her lips turning blue. She couldn't even scream anymore, her throat raw, voice shredded by panic and cold. Above her, the laughter of guests was faintly audible through the floorboards. Champagne flowed, forks clinked against fine china, and Michael laughed easily with a woman in a silver dress, Vanessa, his longtime mistress. They clinked glasses together in a toast to new beginnings, while Clara lay crumpled in the bow, freezer below, whispering the same name over and over again like a prayer. "Michael! Why?" She tried crawling toward the corner, hoping there might be a latch, a lever, something, anything to open the door. Her bare feet left red smudges on the floor, her vision blurred. The frost on the inside of the freezer walls had begun to grow, thick enough now that the room seemed to close in on her, like a coffin slowly sealing shut. Back upstairs, Vanessa leaned in to kiss Michael's cheek. "She won't cause more." "Trouble," she whispered behind a rehearsed smile, posing for a photo with him. "She's handled," Michael replied smoothly, raising his glass to the camera. "Let's just enjoy tonight." Meanwhile, downstairs, Clara's body shook uncontrollably. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, her thoughts slipping. Her hands trembled as she touched her belly, whispering to the child inside her, barely able to form words. The cold had dulled everything: pain, fear, time. She blinked slowly, eyelids heavy. Blood had frozen in thin lines across her knuckles. Every movement was a battle against gravity. Her teeth chattered as she tried one last time to cry for help. But no sound came out. The maid who had cleaned Clara's room every day for the past 3 years was on her way down to retrieve a bottle of wine. She wasn't supposed to go alone. Only the chef had clearance. But the guests were demanding, and someone had mentioned the reserve bottles. She stepped quietly down the narrow stairwell, humming a lullaby to herself in Spanish. As she entered the cellar, she noticed something strange, a trail of red droplets near the freezer. At first she thought it was wine. Then she saw the frost. Then the handprint. She rushed to the door, eyes wide, and peered through the narrow vertical window of the freezer. At first she couldn't see anything. The frost was too thick. But then a slight movement caught her eye. Clara's face appeared, pale and barely conscious, pressed against the glass. Her lips moved slowly, mouthing something the maid couldn't hear. Without thinking, the maid ran. She didn't scream. She didn't call Michael. She ran straight for the chef's kitchen and burst through the door. "She's down there," she cried in Spanish. "Señora Clara, she's locked in the freezer." The chef dropped his ladle. "What?" "Now. She'll die." Together they rushed back downstairs, keys in hand. As the maid pounded on the door and shouted Clara's name, the chef's hands fumbled with the lock. The first key didn't fit, neither did the second. He swore under his breath, sweat beading on his forehead as he tried a third. Finally, the bolt slid free, and the heavy door creaked open. Clara collapsed outward, her body falling limp into the chef's arms. Her skin was ice cold, her breaths faint and irregular. Her hands were frozen into claw-like shapes, and her eyes were barely open. The maid screamed for a phone, and someone above finally took notice. Footsteps rushed down as emergency calls were made. Michael appeared at the top of the stairs, his face twisting into a mask of feigned confusion. "What happened?" he asked, descending with exaggerated urgency. The chef looked up at him, eyes blazing. "She was in there locked. You did this." Michael hesitated, just for a moment. But it was enough. The maid saw it. The chef saw it. And so did Clara, whose eyelids fluttered faintly at the sound of his voice. She knew. Even if she didn't have the strength to speak, the truth was already bleeding into the room with every cold, shallow breath she drew. Before we dive deeper, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional, suspense-filled stories like this one. The sharp scent of disinfectant and the low hum of fluorescent lights greeted Clara as her eyes fluttered open. Her vision blurred, every muscle heavy with exhaustion and cold. She could barely move her fingers, but she felt the weight of an IV line in her hand and something strapped to her wrist. She blinked hard. The ceiling above her wasn't the one she remembered from home. It was blank, sterile, and unfamiliar. She tried to sit up, but her body didn't obey. Her mouth opened, but only a hoarse whisper came out. A nurse noticed the motion and approached with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're safe now, Mrs. Chambers. You had an episode, but you're being taken care of." Clara furrowed her brow. She wanted to speak, to ask what she meant, but the nurse gently pressed a finger to her lips and said, "Rest. Your husband has explained everything. You'll get better soon." Then she turned and left the room, the door clicking shut behind her with an unsettling echo. Outside that very hospital, just hours earlier, Michael stood on a makeshift podium set up at the foot of the estate's marble staircase. A row of cameras flashed in bursts as reporters threw questions at him. He wore a black suit and sorrow like a mask. Vanessa stood just behind him, her hand placed subtly over her stomach, a silk dress draped carefully to suggest a baby bump that didn't yet exist. "My wife has been battling mental health issues for some time," Michael said solemnly into the microphones. "Last night she suffered a severe breakdown. She locked herself in a wine freezer. We're lucky a staff member found her in time." The reporters leaned in, pens scribbling, lenses zooming. One asked, "Is it true she's been deemed unfit to care for the child?" Michael paused, nodding slowly. "The doctors are evaluating her now. It's been very difficult, especially for our unborn child." He reached back, taking Vanessa's hand. "We're doing what's best for the baby, and for Clara. She needs rest, privacy, and love." The sympathy poured in immediately. Talk shows the next morning debated postpartum psychosis. "A tragic case of pressure and privilege colliding," one host said, while images of Michael comforting Vanessa played on screen. Social media flooded with hashtags like "Pray for Clara" and "Strength for Michael." No one questioned the story. After all, the man grieving on television was polished, poised, and heartbreakingly gentle. And Clara, well, she wasn't there to speak. For herself. Inside her hospital room, Clara tried again to lift herself. Her body still ached from the cold. She reached for the tray beside her, but found only a paper cup of pills and a single plastic spoon. She turned her wrist and saw a band. Not a hospital tag, but a colored wristband she recognized from her volunteer work in mental health shelters. It marked her as under psychiatric evaluation. Her mouth went dry. Panicking, she reached for the bedside drawer. Empty. No phone, no emergency button. She looked toward the door, but it had no interior handle, just a flat surface with a sensor lock. A nurse returned shortly after, carrying a folder. She smiled the same vacant smile and checked Clara's vitals, then began scribbling on a chart. "My husband," Clara rasped. "Where is Michael?" The nurse glanced at her but didn't answer directly. "You've been placed under observation for 72 hours. You suffered severe hypothermia and psychological distress." "I didn't lock myself in there," Clara said, louder this time. "He did. He left me." The nurse's pen didn't pause. "You've said that before, Clara. It's okay. That's why you're here. You need help." "I need a lawyer," she demanded. "I need my phone. We've removed all digital access for your safety." Clara's voice cracked. "That freezer. He left me. I'm pregnant. He tried to kill me." But the nurse simply stood, nodded once, and walked out again, leaving Clara in a quiet so complete it might have been a tomb. The walls seemed to press in closer, the room colder than it should have been. She stared at the small round camera above the door, its red light blinking steadily. She was being watched, but not for care, for control. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Michael walked Vanessa through the nursery Clara had started designing months ago. The walls were still painted in soft grays and cream whites, with a hand-stitched mobile still hanging above the crib. Vanessa trailed her fingers over the wooden frame of the rocking chair, frowning. "This is hers," she said with mild distaste. Michael nodded. "For now. But all of this, everything, will be ours. The estate, the trust fund, the company. You just have to keep playing your part." Vanessa smirked, smoothing her palm over the slight curve of her stomach. "Then I better start showing soon." "You will," Michael said coolly. "We'll get you in for some staged ultrasounds. Public enough to be seen, private enough to be protected." She raised a brow. "And the real baby?" Michael poured himself a drink, eyes distant. "She won't keep it. Not where she's going. I've spoken to the right people." He didn't see the housekeeper pause just outside the door. She'd been walking past with linens when she heard the last few words. She stayed silent, then moved on without a sound, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of the laundry basket. Back in the hospital, Clara curled into herself, clutching her belly like it was the only real thing she had left. A nurse had entered briefly to hand her another cup of pills. No label, just white tablets and paper. Clara waited until the nurse turned her back, then slipped them under her pillow, determined not to swallow anything until she understood exactly what was happening. By nightfall, the window in her room began to reflect her shape clearly under the dim lights. She stared at herself, pale skin, dark circles, hospital gown gaping open slightly at the neck. Her image looked like a ghost. But she was still here, still breathing, still carrying the one truth they couldn't erase. Somewhere across the city, Michael raised a toast to the future, clinking glasses with board members and smiling beside Vanessa, while reporters captured every perfectly framed image. He had successfully erased Clara from public view, a fragile woman, unfit to speak for herself. But Clara wasn't gone, and she wasn't done. The hallway lights dimmed just past midnight, and the security shift changed with little fanfare. The junior nurse moved quickly, her ID badge swinging as she entered Clara's room without knocking. Clara had been waiting. Her shoes were already on, her hospital bracelet sliced open with a plastic knife she'd hidden from dinner 2 nights ago. The nurse, barely older than 25, looked nervous but resolute. "I volunteered at your shelter 2 years ago," she whispered, helping Clara to her feet. "You gave me a place when I had nowhere to go. Now I'm returning the favor." They moved fast. The side door near the laundry carts led into a narrow alley where a rusted Corolla waited with the engine running. Clara sank into the back seat, wincing as she held her belly. The cold air outside was a punch compared to the hospital room's artificial warmth, but it was nothing like that freezer. She could breathe here, really breathe. The nurse tossed her a thick hoodie and a pair of gloves. "There's cash in the glove box. Don't call anyone. Don't go home. Just go far." The car pulled away under the cover of night, headlights off until the first corner. By morning, Clara was gone from every system the hospital had. The files claimed she'd been transferred to a private rehabilitation facility. The name was fake. No one checked. The drive took 5 hours into the outskirts of a forgotten woodland Clara hadn't seen since her mother passed. The small cabin tucked deep behind a row of dying evergreens had once been her escape as a teenager. No one had touched it in years. Moss clung to the stone steps. The roof sagged. The windows were smudged with the kind of dirt that only time could create. But Clara had the key. She stepped inside and felt the air shift around her like a breath held too long. Dust curled in the faint shafts of sunlight that broke through broken blinds. Her fingers brushed along the table where her mother used to write poems no one ever read. The place smelled like old wood and buried grief. But it was hers. And it was quiet. She bolted the door and leaned against it, sliding slowly to the floor. The silence wasn't comforting, but it wasn't monitored. No nurses, no cameras, no Michael. She was still shaking when she finally opened the backpack the nurse had packed for her. Water bottles, granola bars, a burner phone, and an envelope of cash. She tucked it beneath the mattress and let herself sleep for the first time in days. The next morning brought fog and the sound of dripping from the sagging roof. Clara used a bucket to catch the leaks and wore 2 layers of clothing just to stay warm. There was no heat, but there was power. Barely. She found a switch behind the old fireplace that still buzzed when flipped. Most of the appliances were dead, but she got a small lamp to work. The soft yellow glow revealed more than she expected, a cracked painting on the far wall, partly torn to reveal a hollow frame. Curious, she pulled it down and behind it found a narrow compartment. Her mother's safe. She remembered it vaguely, but the code came back in a heartbeat. Her mother's birthday. The lock clicked. Inside were a stack of old documents wrapped in a plastic bag, 2 USB drives, and a small black journal bound in worn leather. Clara sat down at the table and began going through them, page by page. The first envelope held a series of identification papers, 3 different names, all with photos of Vanessa. Clara's breath caught. One name matched an old arrest record from Nevada. Another was tied to a shell company based in the Cayman Islands. All 3 had the same face, just different lives. Clara spread them out on the table like puzzle pieces. Her hands trembled as she opened the next envelope, a copy of Michael's prenuptial agreement. But something was off. There were 2 versions, one with her signature and one without. Her eyes darted back and forth comparing clauses. In one, she would receive 50% of assets in case of infidelity. In the other, nothing. The one on file with the city had been switched. Forged. She felt sick. The back door creaked. She froze. A voice called out, low but familiar. "You always did hide well." She grabbed the fire poker from beside the old stove and crept toward the door. When she pulled it open, the man standing there stepped back slowly, hands raised in peace. His beard was thick, eyes weathered, and his coat was patched with old repairs. "Troy?" she whispered. He nodded once. "You look like hell." "So do you." They didn't hug. There wasn't time. He stepped inside, letting the cold air follow. "I heard what happened," he said. eyeing the documents on the table. Didn't believe it. Not at first. I'm being erased, she said quietly. Framed. Michael's pretending I've lost my mind. Troy picked up the prenup copies, whistled low. That signature's fake. He's stupid to think no one would spot it. He's counting on no one seeing it at all, Clara muttered. Troy sat down, cracking his knuckles. I've been off the grid since your mother died. Didn't want to get pulled back into that mess. But this? He tapped the USB drives. What else is on here? Clara slid one across the table. I haven't checked yet. I don't have a laptop. Everything I had was taken. Troy pulled a small device from his coat. I've got something. Not much, but it'll do. He booted up an old military-grade tablet and inserted the drive. A few seconds later, folders popped up. Names, bank accounts, audio files. He played one. Michael's voice came through, recorded during what sounded like a call. She won't be a problem. She's too emotional to fight. Once she's out, I'll have full control of the board. Vanessa will take over the charity, make it look clean. Clara sat back, hand over her mouth. There's more, Troy said, clicking into another folder. A scanned birth certificate, altered. Photos of Vanessa and a man Clara didn't recognize, timestamps overlapping with the time she supposedly conceived Michael's child. Troy looked at her. You ready to burn this whole empire down? Clara stared at the screen, her voice steady now. I'm done surviving, Troy nodded. Then let's start digging. Rain hammered against the cabin roof as Troy scrolled through another folder. On the battered tablet, his eyes narrowing as lines of data loaded across the screen. Clara stood behind him, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her breath shallow. Every new document felt like another nail driven into a coffin that had been built in secret while she slept beside the man she thought she knew. Troy paused on a video file and played it without a word. The grainy footage showed Vanessa, much younger, seated on a luxurious leather couch. Across from her, sipping whiskey and visibly older, sat a man Clara recognized instantly, Charles Chambers, Michael's father. The date stamp in the corner was from 8 years ago. Pause it, Clara whispered. Troy tapped the screen. That's the house in Montauk, she said. Michael never let me visit there, said it was his father's private retreat. Troy rewound the video and hit play again, letting it run longer. At one point, Vanessa leaned over and kissed Charles on the mouth. Clara flinched. The video cut out shortly after, replaced by a series of emails, cryptic at first, then more direct. Michael had acquired the footage 2 years ago, around the same time Charles altered his will and removed his own son from primary inheritance. But within months, the will had changed again, this time favoring Michael entirely. Clara didn't need an investigator to piece the rest together. He used this, she said, voice low and sharp, to blackmail his father. He forced him to change the will back. And Vanessa, she wasn't just some gold-digging girlfriend. She's been part of this since the beginning. Troy sighed and closed the tablet. The rabbit hole's deep, Clara. And it's not just them. I found a list of names. People paid off, lawyers swapped, even your own estate manager. The network's wide. Clara turned to the window, her reflection faint in the glass. Her hand instinctively rested on her belly. My child was supposed to be born into something beautiful, a legacy my mother helped build, a foundation meant to help women. And it's all been twisted. Troy stood and reached for his coat. There's more we need to see, but it's not on a hard drive. They drove through winding dirt roads to the outskirts of the city, where Troy's trailer sat wedged between trees like a forgotten military post. Inside, files were stacked in milk crates, walls pinned with notes and photos from cases Troy had worked before he disappeared off-grid. He pulled down a box marked C. Chambers and placed it on the table. Clara opened the top and froze. The first photo was of her sister. Elena stood beside Michael, laughing, holding a wine glass in one hand and a phone in the other. It was time-stamped 2 weeks before Clara was locked in the freezer. The next was an email printout from Elena to Michael, marked with a subject line that made Clara's blood run cold. She's heading to the cabin, alone. No. Clara muttered. She told me to go. She said I'd be safe there. She told me to run. She also told Michael where you'd be, Troy said quietly. I tracked her IP. That email came from her condo's Wi-Fi. Clara's knees buckled. She caught herself against the table, breath catching in her throat. Her sister, her only living family, had sold her out, had given up her hiding place, had helped the man who tried to kill her. The room swayed. She turned and stumbled outside, rain splattering across her face as she sank to the ground, mud clinging to her fingers as she clutched the earth. Troy followed but stayed back, giving her space. She didn't cry. Her tears had frozen inside her weeks ago. But she shook, violently, like every betrayal was an aftershock cracking her open all over again. She was supposed to protect me, Clara whispered. After Mom died, we only had each other. She held my hand at my wedding. She called me every day when I was trying to get pregnant. How could she? She's broke, Troy said gently. Credit card debt, gambling. Michael paid off her mortgage, bought her a new car. That kind of loyalty comes easy when the price is right. Clara stood slowly, wiping her hands on her coat, her jaw set. I thought I'd hit bottom. But this is worse. Troy nodded. It is. But now you see the whole picture. And you're still standing. Back at the cabin, Clara didn't sleep. She sat beside the fireplace, going through each document again, this time with a notebook beside her. Dates, names, transactions. She cataloged everything with the precision of someone who'd once led charitable audits for abused women and knew how to trace fraud from memory. Each hour passed like a slow resurrection. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was building a case. By morning, the storm had passed, and the sky was a pale gray. Clara stepped outside into the chill, the air crisp and silent. She didn't look fragile anymore. Her face was drawn, but focused. Her movements slow but deliberate. Troy joined her with a thermal mug of coffee. You know this won't be easy. I don't need easy, Clara replied, staring toward the tree line. I need true. I need my child to be born into something real. He handed her the mug. Then, we get to work, quietly, carefully, and when the time's right, we bury them with their own lies, Clara nodded. They wanted me gone, forgotten, broken. But I'm going to make sure every single person who helped them gets pulled into the light. Troy smiled slightly. That's the Clara I remember. She looked up at the cabin roof, still sagging and cracked, and said, This place gave my mother peace. It's about to give me purpose. They didn't speak again for the rest of the morning. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees above them. But Clara didn't flinch. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like prey. She felt like fire. The lobby of the investment firm buzzed with the low murmur of conversations and the clack of designer heels on marble floors. No one paid much attention to the woman standing at the reception desk, dressed in muted tones, a silk scarf draped neatly around her hairline, and dark sunglasses masking half her face. She handed over a leather folder and spoke with the soft, practiced accent of a well-traveled European widow. Vivian Hale. My late husband handled everything before. I'm simply here to move our capital where it belongs, quietly. The receptionist smiled politely, scanning the documents. Everything looked legitimate. Trust fund certification, asset transfer records. A portfolio that made her look like exactly what she claimed to be, the grieving widow of a tech magnate. No one would have guessed that behind the tinted lenses was Clara Chambers, the woman the media had quietly forgotten after Michael's announcement of her long-term psychiatric care. While the world had moved on, Clara had re-entered through the back door, cloaked in wealth, silence, and strategy. 3 days later, Clara stood in a private boardroom overlooking downtown, sipping tea as she reviewed her newly purchased shares. Small stakes, but placed carefully through proxy names. Troy had handled the technical side, using shell corporations they'd quietly reactivated from her mother's dormant nonprofits. Bit by bit, they were gaining influence inside the company Michael had stolen with a forged prenup and a fake pregnancy. The why. First journalist Clara contacted worked for a mid-tier financial watchdog site. He didn't recognize her at first, not in her new appearance, not under her new name. But when she slid the forged signature copies and off-record bank transfers across the table, his interest lit like a match. She didn't ask for a headline, just truth, the kind that starts quiet and catches fire slowly. The next move took her to the real estate offices managing Michael's personal holdings. Clara posed as an anonymous buyer, offering cash, no inspection, and above-market rates. Within 48 hours, she controlled the deed to a modest but strategic downtown property, a commercial corner that would soon host her public return, but not yet. That evening, Clara arrived at a black-tie gala hosted by Michael's charity foundation. Security barely looked twice at her invitation, procured weeks ago through a silent auction under a donor alias. The ballroom sparkled with chandeliers and curated laughter. Waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne and smoked oysters. She moved through them like a ghost, careful to stay in the shadows, always close enough to observe, never close enough to be seen. Across the room, Michael stood near the stage, charming as ever in a midnight blue tuxedo. His hand rested on the small of Vanessa's back as she leaned into the microphone to thank the guests for their generosity. The fabric of her dress clung, tightly around a belly that seemed perfectly round and pronounced, yet Clara watched her move, lift a glass, pivot sharply in heels. It wasn't real. The bump had been exaggerated, and her gait had none of the cautious weight a real pregnancy carried. Vanessa smiled for the cameras, one hand protectively covering the bump. "We're so grateful to be bringing a new life into this world, and doing it with the support of all of you means everything." Clara stepped back as the crowd applauded. She didn't need proof in that moment. The bump was all performance. But she already had the trail started. The key was the OB/GYN's private clinic, where both Clara and Vanessa had been patients, only a few months apart. Troy had hacked into the clinic's patient communication server using an old system vulnerability they discovered weeks ago. Clara waited at a small cafe near the waterfront as he decrypted the files. When the email thread finally loaded, her fingers tightened around the ceramic cup. There it was. Clara's full medical report, confirming not just her legitimate pregnancy, but also previous fertility treatments and prenatal complications. Then came Vanessa's file. Negative pregnancy test. Repeat visit 2 weeks later, still negative. Then a final entry noting, no follow-up and no confirmation of pregnancy from lab diagnostics. The timelines overlapped exactly with the day Michael had made his first public statement. She printed the files in triplicate, locked them in separate locations, one with her lawyer contact, one with Troy, and one in a fireproof safe beneath, the floorboards of her temporary apartment. She knew better than to rely on a single smoking gun. This wasn't a story. It was a war built on credibility, timing, and undeniable proof. 2 mornings later, she watched from across the street as Michael and Vanessa entered the foundation headquarters. Clara stood by a food truck, blending in with the morning commuters, sipping coffee and making notes on a burner phone. Security had changed, more cameras, more ID scanning, but Troy was already mapping blind spots in the layout. If Clara needed to walk in before the endgame, she would. But only after the world was watching. At night, she sat alone in her apartment, just a furnished rental on a month-to-month lease under a fake name. She marked off names on a list. Estate manager, paid off. Family lawyer, compromised. Sister, exiled. The web had been tangled. But now, strand by strand, she was cutting through it. She watched old footage of herself on the news, the last public photo taken before her disappearance. A still image from a charity gala. Her eyes looked softer then. Her smile was real, but the woman on that screen was gone now. The woman in her place wore armor made of silence and scars. She no longer needed rescue. She needed resolve, and it was almost time. The boardroom buzzed with anticipation as investors, journalists, and high-level executives filed into the glossy, glass-walled conference space at Chambers Global HQ. The event was live-streamed, branded as a strategic outlook and executive announcement. Cameras panned across rows of shareholders and analysts seated at polished oak tables, their screens loaded with financial dashboards and quarterly forecasts. At the head of the room, Michael adjusted his tie, smiling as he nodded to Vanessa, who sat beside him in a soft cream maternity gown. Her hand rested carefully over her supposed baby bump, the perfect image of support and loyalty. Michael leaned into the microphone and began with his usual poise. "We've weathered storms before, but this new chapter for Chambers Global will be defined by growth, transparency, and leadership that puts families first." The applause that followed was polite but calculated, shareholders eager to see rising stock and stable management. Michael gestured to a digital projection behind him, displaying the foundation's new branches, Vanessa's face front and center beside the slogan, "Nurturing Futures." The doors at the back of the room opened, chairs scraped as heads turned. A few phones rose instinctively, assuming it was another guest speaker, but silence rippled through the room when Clara stepped into view. She wore a dark suit, clean, formal, and understated, with her hair tied back and no makeup to soften the sharpness in her eyes. A legal pad was tucked under one arm, and in her other hand, a slim briefcase. Two men in tailored gray suits followed. Behind her, federal agents. Michael's face drained of color. Vanessa froze. Clara didn't speak as she walked to the front. She didn't have to. The agents moved around her, one stepping to the mic and flashing a badge. "This meeting is now under legal review. We advise all shareholders and corporate representatives to remain seated." Gasps spread through the room. Michael took a step forward, forcing a laugh. "This is absurd. Clara is not authorized to be here. She's under psychiatric evaluation." Clara finally spoke, voice steady and clear. "That lie won't work anymore." She opened the briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. With quiet precision, she laid out the original prenuptial agreement, her actual signed copy, and the forged version Michael had filed with the estate registrar. Next came property transfer documents, signed under an identity Michael used to route holdings into offshore accounts under Vanessa's name. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. Each paper was placed in a row like evidence in a courtroom. "The prenup was altered without my consent. These properties were transferred illegally. And the woman beside you is not pregnant." The room exploded in murmurs. One reporter live streaming from the side clutched her earpiece and said into her phone, "Are we getting this? She's alleging fraud. On record. On camera." Vanessa stood slowly, face pale, lips trembling. "She's lying," she said weakly, a hand over her belly. "She's trying to hurt us." "Michael, say something." Michael's mouth opened, then closed again. The legal agents moved toward him as another screen lit up behind the stage. It was Clara again, this time on video, recorded testimony, time-stamped, verified, and backed by documents. She detailed the night she was locked in the freezer, the manipulated press releases, and the DNA reports recovered from the OB/GYN servers. It was clinical, undeniable. The screen split into side-by-side records, Clara's confirmed pregnancy results, and Vanessa's negative test results, shown with date stamps and official headers. Vanessa took one step backward, her heels catching the edge of the platform. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into the chair behind her, breath shallow and hand still over her stomach. No one moved to help her. One of the federal agents stepped to Michael. "Michael Chambers, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, medical obstruction, and attempted manslaughter." Flashbulbs erupted as reporters screamed questions. "Is this true, Michael? Did you fake the pregnancy? Was Clara institutionalized against her will?" He tried to bolt. Two agents caught him before he reached the stairs. Handcuffs snapped tight around his wrists. Vanessa sobbed into her hands, mascara streaking down her cheeks, the fabric of her dress bunching around her fake bump as she doubled over. Clara stood motionless at the edge of the stage. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply watched, as the empire that had been stolen from her began to crack apart. Not with fire or violence, but with the calm, methodical force of truth. One board member removed his lapel pin, another shook his head and left the room entirely. Shareholders whispered among themselves, already calculating losses, exits, public responses. Clara's attorney moved forward to finalize statements with the legal team, but she remained still, eyes on the chaos she'd waited so long to unleash. On the screen behind her, the final line of her recorded testimony played. "I was silenced, erased, and buried. But I survived, and now so will my truth." And the room, once filled with confident murmurs and polite smiles, now buzzed with the undeniable sound of reckoning. The air outside the courthouse was dry and warm, filled with the low hum of reporters, clicking cameras, and hushed conversation as Clara stepped onto the granite steps holding her newborn daughter close to her chest. The baby stirred slightly beneath a soft cream blanket, her tiny face tucked against Clara's shoulder. The crowd parted respectfully as she passed, no longer the woman painted as unstable or forgotten. The final ruling had just been delivered. Michael's empire stripped from him, his assets frozen, his sentence set for trial on multiple counts. But more importantly, Clara had reclaimed what mattered: her name, her dignity, and her daughter's legal inheritance. The court had restored full guardianship and acknowledged her as sole heir to her own family's foundation. Yet, when the judge asked whether she wished to assume control of Michael's company and its vast estate portfolio, Clara declined without hesitation. A week later, she stood in front of a modest brick building with white pillars and wide glass doors. A temporary banner flapped gently in the breeze. The Haven House, for every woman they tried to silence. Inside, the lobby had been transformed, with soft lighting, fresh linens, warm colors, and photos of women rebuilding their lives, smiling, working, holding children of their own. The space was funded by the very assets Clara had won but refused to keep. She had sold off Michael's vacation estates, emptied the private accounts he had buried offshore, and redirected everything into this place. Her attorneys questioned the move. Advisors called it reckless. But Clara knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't rebuilding a business. She was building a wall between the past and every woman who would walk through these doors in the future. She held her daughter, close as she stepped up to the podium. The press had gathered again, but this time there was no court security, no legal drama, just a crowd of survivors, volunteers, and quietly curious donors. She didn't speak long, only a few words about safety, choice, and freedom. She thanked the nurses who had protected her, the investigator who had risked his name, and her late mother, whose memory stood silently behind every choice she had made. When the ribbon was cut, Clara let the baby's small hand grip the ceremonial scissors, her laughter gentle and pure in the open air. The cameras flashed again, but this time they caught something new: Clara smiling without armor. At the edge of the crowd, just beyond the gated sidewalk, a black car idled with tinted windows. Inside, Michael sat handcuffed beside a U.S. Marshal, waiting to be transferred to a holding facility. They had allowed him one last detour under strict watch, though the judge had warned him it would serve no purpose. He looked older already, thinner, the arrogance drained from his posture. His eyes followed Clara as she held the baby and spoke with volunteers. She didn't look back, not once. Vanessa had vanished days earlier. Rumors said she'd fled the country, her real name finally exposed. The media had moved on quickly after the trial's outcome, distracted by newer scandals and financial shifts. But Clara hadn't disappeared into luxury or politics. She'd disappeared into purpose. After the ceremony, she walked down the stone steps of the shelter, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. A few reporters followed but respected the silent rule she had set. No questions about Michael, no questions about the past. A little girl ran up and handed her a drawing, a woman with a cape holding a baby, standing in front of a red building. Clara knelt and hugged the child, tears pricking her eyes. She'd been called many things over the past year. Unstable, dramatic, a liability. But this, from the eyes of a child, this was what mattered. That evening, she stood at the back of the shelter, rocking her daughter gently beneath the trees in the courtyard garden. The sun had dipped low, casting a golden hue across the brick. The wind was soft, brushing through her hair, and the baby's tiny breath rose and fell steadily against her chest. A few volunteers laughed nearby, preparing rooms for the next group of arrivals. Troy walked out, handing her a sealed envelope, final proof that all ownership had been transferred. Michael had signed the surrender order under pressure from prosecutors, and his board had dissolved. Clara tucked the envelope away without opening it. She didn't need signatures to feel free. She walked slowly through the courtyard, pausing by the mural newly painted along the side wall, a hand breaking through ice, reaching for a child. Below it, in quiet script, the words, "You are not invisible. You are not alone." From across the street, the courthouse still loomed, gray and cold, against the evening light, but Clara didn't look at it. Her eyes stayed forward, her footsteps steady. She passed the press vans, the curious onlookers, the whispers. She didn't stop. She had no interest in telling the world what she had done. She was too busy living. He tried to freeze her story in silence, but she melted every lie with the heat of truth. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and stay with us for more.